Hello. Good evening, my friends. Welcome to the Vampire Book Club. Thank you for joining me tonight. We are a small crowd tonight. I wonder if more people will come if I give it a minute. In the meantime, I'm going to drink some wine. This is a red blend. Actually, I'm thematic with our book tonight. Sometimes my drink is thematic, and sometimes there was a lot of wine and blood drunk as wine in this book. So I hope you are drinking with me. So, the Vampire Book Club is a book club where we read one vampire book every month. We vote on the books, usually, not this month, but usually we vote on the books as a club. The books are selected from my vampire library, this bookshelf you see behind me. And this month we read this book, The Shambling Guide to New York City by Mur Lafferty. I've read one of Mur Lafferty's books before, which was not a vampire book. It was a science fiction book. So I was familiar with her writing, but not with her vampire writing. And this was my first exposure to her fantasy writing. So I was intrigued. I liked her writing before, so I had high hopes for this book. This is a urban fantasy novel. It's kind of a humorous urban fantasy novel. And if you're unaware, urban fantasy is a genre where monsters, magical things, fantasy elements exist in the real world alongside human society, often secret from human society, but not always. For instance, like True Blood is urban fantasy, but the supernatural creatures in that universe have come out, and that's the premise of the story. But in this book, they're living in secret alongside human society. And the main character is a human who discovers that supernatural creatures exist among us and has to deal with that. And this is her story. So, The Shambling Guide to New York City is a travel book, like a walking guide to a city, but shambling because monsters shamble instead of walk. And it is a travel guide to New York City specifically made for monsters. And this book consists of the story of that travel guide's making, along with excerpts from the travel guide. So it's kind of a cool format with that. And the main character, who I guess is supposed to be this person, even though she doesn't look like how the character is described in the book at all, her name is Zoe, which we find out also means the word life. And she has recently moved back to New York City. She used to live there as a child. She was living in North Carolina for a while. She had a job at a publishing company. She was a managing editor of a travel book company. But she had an affair with her boss. She did not know her boss was married. Then her boss's wife found out about the affair and scared her out of town. So Zoe ran out of town. Her boss's wife was a cop, and when she broke into Zoe's house to try to kill Zoe or kick her ass, Zoe called 911 to try to be like, "There's someone broke into my house," and they're like, "Yeah, she's a cop, so we're not going to do anything." So no one would help Zoe, so she had to run out of town, and she moved back to New York City. So now she's jobless, friendless, in the big city, all by herself. She needs a job, and that's how the book starts. Saying something about my frame rate, I don't know if I can help that. I'm sorry if my frame rate is bothering you. I have no control over this live stream's frame rate. If you know how I can improve it, please let me know. My camera is excellent. It's just YouTube that I think is causing the problems. So listen to my voice. If you cannot see the picture very well, I apologize. Zoe is exploring New York City because as a travel guide writer, that's what she does. So she finds this little out-of-the-way bookshop that's very shabby looking, like a mom and pop shop. She goes in, she wants to explore it. It's very filthy, it's disgusting, and the books on the shelves are really weird. They're like How to Train Your Hellhound, and she's like, these can't be real books. But she's very intrigued because she's a curious person. So she picks up a book and she says, "I want to buy the book." And the shopkeeper is like, "We don't sell to your kind." She's like, what does that mean? But she notices a guy hanging up a help wanted job poster in the bookshop looking for editors for a travel guide. And she's like, hey, that's exactly what I do. I would like to apply for that job. And he's like, well, it's my company. And no, we don't hire your kind. And she's like, what does that mean? So she's kind of annoyed, but it also kind of makes her want to do it harder. So she leaves and she goes to a nearby cafe, and she's sitting in this cafe and she sees the same help wanted publishing company looking for editors for a travel guide poster. So she's like, I'm going to apply for this job anyway. And there's a guy in this cafe, and he's kind of just like a dumpy looking guy. And he's like, oh, you wouldn't fit in with that publishing company. You shouldn't apply there. And she's like, how do you know? He's like, well, I work there and I know that they wouldn't hire you. They would never give you a chance. And she's like, well, that just makes me want to do it harder. So she applies for the job. And then the original guy that she saw is like, you know what? I like your gumption. Come on in for an interview. And once you hear what the job is about, you'll see you won't even want the job. So she's like, oh, that just makes me want it harder. She's a very spunky lady. So she is about to go to this job interview. And the dumpy guy in the cafe is like, since I work there, I'll walk there with you. So he takes her there. His name is John. And he's kind of weird. He's very flirty, but he's very dumpy looking. So she's like, where does he get off? I don't know. So he takes her to the place where the job is. And even though it's a publishing company, it is in a Broadway theater that's been like closed down. So it's like an old ramshackle Broadway theater that they've converted into a publishing house, you know, because that's what you do in New York City. It's very cool. And she goes in. I'm sorry about the video quality, friends. I really don't know what to do. It looks fine on my end. It's the bandwidth, you say? I don't know what I can do. If you know how I can fix it, please let me know. So she goes to this theater. She meets the owner of the publishing company, and he's like, why do you want this job so bad? So many people have told you that this job is not right for you. You won't fit in here. She's like, I have experience in writing travel books. I'm perfect for this job. Well, what is it, a book for like gay people? Is it a book for Jews? You know, if it's for a specific audience, I'm not a bigot. That's fine. I can write for any audience. I probably wouldn't write for you if you were bigots. So if you're like, you know, the KKK, I won't want this job. But if it's not something like that, I think I can do it. And he's like, I don't know. Let's go out for dinner. Let me take you to dinner, and I'll tell you more about who we're writing this book for. So she's like, well, I'm not going to date you because I dated my last boss, and that got me in a lot of trouble. And he's like, trust me, it's not a date. Not interested in you. Let me just take you to dinner. So he takes her to this restaurant, and everyone else at this publishing company is just like, what's she doing? So he takes her to this restaurant, and it's very weird. It's kind of like a goth Italian restaurant. And she gets there, and people are acting weird. She orders wine. He orders wine. His wine is strangely viscous in his glass. And as she's watching the other people eating, she's like, oh, I get it. You all are cosplayers, because the waiter looks like a zombie. She's like, I can write a book for cosplayers. I used to play D&D in college. It's fine. And he's like, seriously? You think we're cosplayers? But then she sees these people who look like demons at the next table start eating live hedgehogs. And then she looks at the owner of the publishing company and realizes that he has vampire fangs and he's drinking blood. And then she faints. And then she wakes up, and he's like, you know what? I like you. If you still want this job tomorrow, now that you know what we are, call me. And she's like, wait, I don't know what you are. I just fainted. I don't know anything, because she's still like in the denial stage. So he takes her home. He drops her off at home. She's like very confused. She's like half asleep. She's like, wait, that dude didn't even buy me dinner. I just got a glass of wine. So she goes home to her new apartment, and she runs into the hallway, her sexy neighbor. She has a sexy neighbor, and he is like a very muscular, good-looking guy. And then she goes into her apartment, and she goes to sleep. The next day she wakes up, and she's like, apparently monsters are real. Okay, this is a travel guide book for monsters, and they're real, and they live in New York City, and they always have, and they've been around me this whole time, and now I'm scared because there's monsters lurking around every corner. What do I do? But you know what? even though they're all like, you won't fit in here because you're human and we're monsters and you don't belong here. She's like, that just makes me want the job even harder. So she decides she's going to take this job despite being like actually scared. She's not dumb. She's scared. So she goes back there and she tells them, you know what? I'm perfect for this job. Can you promise me that I'll be safe? Like, you're not going to try to eat me? And he's like, as long as you're working here in this building, you will be safe in this building. I can't promise you anything out there in the world. If you have to go out and do field research for the travel guide, you're on your own. It's a risk you're going to have to accept. But here in this building, no one will eat you, I promise. Because there are zombies that work there that do want to eat her brains. There's a vampire who wants to suck her blood. There's an incubus who offer sexual energy, basically rape her. Like, it's a very scary place. And he's like, we can't offer you benefits, but I'll give you a high enough pay that you could afford your own health care. He says, we usually don't pay in, human dollars. We pay in like supernatural tokens, but, I'll pay you in human dollars. You really are experienced. You can bring experiences book. You'll be good for this job if you can handle the monsters. And she's like, you know what? That just makes me want it even harder. So she takes the job, despite all of her like instincts telling her this is dangerous. What else is she going to do, So he tells her she's going to start in 2 weeks. So she spends 2 weeks researching monsters. She goes to the library and she like gets books on Dracula and stuff. Oh yeah, she did that before she even had her interview. And the guy's like, no, those books are stupid. Let me give you real books. So he gives her real books about monsters. And she realizes that all these books on monsters he's giving her are all very old, very outdated. And she's like, we need some modern books about monsters that humans can read to understand, if they're involved in this world. So, we can publish these books, and we're a publishing company. So she's already working. And, we don't call them monsters, though. That is pejorative. So we call them coterie. That is a name for the monsters in this book. And besides vampires, zombies, demons who eat hedgehogs, incubus, succubus, there's goddesses of all sort of mythologies, gods and goddesses. There's sprites and fey creatures of all sorts of mythologies. Pretty much anything you can think of. The only thing that she doesn't ever encounter is a werewolf. And she even thinks about that sometimes. She's like, are werewolves real? I should ask. Put that in my notes for the next guide. So she spends 2 weeks researching monsters, but then she bumps into this person that she thinks is a crazy homeless lady who she had bumped into in that cafe before, and everyone seems scared of this crazy homeless lady. And the woman tells her name is Granny Goodmay, and she tells Zoe that even though she is kind of a crazy homeless lady, she is also a former assassin who's used to killing these coterie and a former CIA agent. So she's going to train Zoe how to defend herself against coterie. So she starts giving Zoe like training and fighting training and conditioning, making her run miles or run laps, and teaching her all the things about the coterie and how to defend herself. Because of course the monsters aren't going to tell Zoe what their weaknesses are and how to defend them. So she starts training Zoe to be like a badass fighter. And when Zoe starts her job, her first day on the job, she's like getting to know everyone. She meets these 2 women. One is a death goddess, a Welsh death goddess, who's described as looking like a goth princess. And the other is a water sprite named Morgan, who ends up becoming her bestie because as a water sprite, she doesn't actually want to eat Zoe. She just turn into water and do things with water. And so she starts planning out the book. She's doing her training. And then one day, she meets all the zombies and everyone. She's making friends. One day, they're still hiring people for this publishing company. So they hire a new, basically the head of HR, only it's not human relations, it's coterie relations. So he's the head of CR. And he's like a Frankenstein's creature. So he's like different body parts from all different dead bodies. They call him a construct. Oh, James West, thank you for the $1.99. So he's a construct. And he's a dick. He is just so mean to everyone. And they're like, for a human relations person, he's really not very good at relating to people. But he's just mean to Zoe right off. He's like, you're a human. You don't belong in a coterie company. And the goddess's name is Gwen. That's all we know. So he's just mean to her, and he's like, you don't talk to me unless you want to quit. I'm not here to help you. You're not coterie. But she is quite thrown off by this guy because his head is her ex-college boyfriend's head. She's like, first of all, I didn't know my ex-college boyfriend died. Second of all, someone's using his head to make this construct and is now here working at this same company I'm working on. And everyone immediately says, the odds of that are just astronomical. There's just no way this is a coincidence. Who is this guy and where did he come from? But it's kind of rude to ask a construct where he came from. So they're going to try to investigate him and try to figure him out on their own. But they can't just ask him who made him and where he came from. So one of the zombies is going to start tailing this guy to try to follow him. And at one point during this time, Zoe gets really drunk one night because she's very upset about this, and so she has a really bad hangover. And this is the beginning of Zoe's no good, terrible, very bad day. So one of the zombies is going to trail him, but after lunch that day, or after the end of work, the zombies tell everyone that their brains that they put in the work fridge for lunch are gone. Someone has stolen their brains, and if zombies don't eat their brains out of their Tupperware, they start going feral and they'll start attacking. And even though they only missed one meal of brains, that shouldn't be enough to make them go feral, but they are starting to go feral. So Zoe, her water sprite friend Morgan, and the guy John, who used to be this very dumpy, just weird guy, who's now suddenly super hot out of nowhere because he's an incubus, and the hungrier he gets, the hotter he gets. So everyone who sees him sees their sexual ideal. So Zoe sees John now as her ultimate sexual ideal. So he's very sexy to her, but she knows he's an incubus, so she doesn't want to get mixed up with him. And he keeps flirting with her, and he keeps trying to draw her energy, and everyone keeps telling him to stop. But there is no sexual harassment policy at her job, because how can there be when you work with literal sex demons? So Morgan, the water sprite, Zoe, and John, the incubus, decide to follow the zombies to make sure they get home okay. Because if they go feral out on the streets of New York, they're going to get, arrested. And the people who sort of monitor monster activity and make sure they don't do anything bad is the Public Works Commission, which is usually the guys who repair sewer mains and stuff in the city. It's a real thing. But the people who work in the sewers are also the secret monster hunters, vampire hunters, zombie hunters of the city, because the people who work in the sewers have the closest connection to where monsters often live. And throughout this book, we're reading excerpts from the Shambling guide that tells us where monsters do live, and all the world building sort of comes in these little news articles that look like this. Oh, you can't really see it very well. Sorry, the light's too bright. Now, Shiva was not in this book. So they follow the zombies, and zombies go to a morgue where they have a hookup with a guy who's supposed to give them brains. And the guy's like, I just gave you brains this week. It's not time for me to give you new brains. I don't have any on hand. Sorry, guys. And the zombies go feral and they attack this guy, which is strictly against the rules. These guys are supposed to be untouchable, not to get attacked. But the zombies attack him, which is really weird. They shouldn't be doing that just from missing one meal. So there's mystery going on. But Zoe's freaking out because she's seeing someone get murdered in front of her. Morgan had disappeared because she's trying to go call their boss, whose name is Phil the vampire, to try to get him to help. And because Zoe's freaking out, the incubus sort of grabs her and starts molesting her and taking advantage of her, because that's what he does. Drags her away, and he's like, oh no, that's how I stopped you from freaking out, by molesting you. It wasn't nice. So they get away, and she's like, what's going to happen to our coworkers, the 3 zombie coworkers? And they don't know what's going to happen, but there's nothing they can do. So Morgan's like, well, let's go out for dinner. We're already out. We're hungry. We'll calm down. I'm going to take you to a special coterie restaurant to help you learn more about it. Because the whole time she's doing this, she's going to coterie places, learning things about coterie so she can write a book, right? So she takes her to a restaurant, and it's a sprite restaurant. So there's water sprites, air sprites, earth sprites, all the different sprites that eat different elements. And since she's a water sprite, she eats like sea scallops and seaweed and stuff. But the whole time they're there, John is molesting Zoe and trying to take advantage of her. And Morgan keeps telling him to stop, and he keeps stopping, but then he keeps trying to do it anyway. Very creepy, very handsy. But it's working because he is Zoe's sexual ideal just from her perception of him. She's very turned on by it against her will. So there's a lot of sort of like sexual moments in this part of the book. And then after the scene, they go to a bondage club. So she's like, we're going to go to this bondage club, which is a place where John can feed off sexual energy. We're going to go to like this BDSM club. And you can see another aspect of coterie lifestyle, and it'll help you forget the zombie attack, right? So we're going to go to this S&M club, but because you're not really dressed for it, you're going to have to pretend to be my sub. So just, act like I'm your master and just do everything I say. John can feed on someone there, and you get to see what, another aspect of coterie society. So they go to this club. And they're looking around and they're seeing things, and they take them down to the private rooms that have viewing windows, and they're watching like the incubuses feed and the succubuses feed, succubi, whatever. And at one point, Morgan gets a phone call, so she leaves Zoe alone with John, and then John just like completely starts taking advantage of Zoe, starts molesting her, takes her in a private room, and it's working because, he has this energy that she's attracted to, and she's very lustful. It's sort of like a partial sex scene. And even though she's saying she consents in it, clearly she's not able to consent because she's under the influence of his magic. But then Granny Goodmay, the little tiny homeless woman vampire slayer, shows up and stops him and rescues Zoe. They get away. And because he was partially, like, she doesn't have sex with John, but they were doing stuff, so it does drain her life force. So she's very drained. She can't control herself. Morgan's very pissed off at John. But they get away. Granny Goodmay gets her away, and Zoe goes home. She's very drained. She comes home at 3 a.m, and she bumps into her hot neighbor again as Morgan is trying to get her home. And she sees her hot neighbor, and she's just like, how come I never see you in the halls? You must work the night shift, and I work the day shift, and we're always passing. And she's hitting on her hot neighbor very embarrassingly because she's still under the incubus's influence. And then she goes inside and collapses and just goes into like the shame spiral of I've made a fool of myself and I almost got raped, and she's very upset. So the next day she goes to work, and sorry, I'm trying to remember. A lot happens in this book. I'm trying to keep things in order. She's back at work. She's trying to get her stuff done. I think this is the part where her boss tells her that she's got she needs to get the book outlined before by end of day that day. He's like, you need to have the book's outline done by the end of the day. And she's like, I had the worst night ever. I had this horrible, I almost got my life force drained hangover. And now I need to get the book outlined. So she's like working on it. She's trying to work on it, and she puts a sign on her door that says, everybody leave me alone. I'm trying to work. And of course, it makes everybody like bother her even more. They're like, what's going on with the brains disappearing? What's going on with the creepy construct who has your ex-boyfriend's head? We got to solve these mysteries. And she's like, I have a deadline. I got to write this outline. That's it. I can't work from here. I'm going home. So she goes home, and she's going to work from home. But because she comes home in the middle of the day, she runs into her hot neighbor again. And she's just like, she sees that he's dressed in a public works uniform. She's like, oh, you work for public works. You must know about coterie too. And he's like, awkward. You were real weird to me. And then she leaves. And then she goes in, she's like, turns off her phone. She turns everything off. She's just going to sit down and do her work. And she does. But then everyone comes, or Gwen and Morgan come to her house, and they're like, your phone's been off all day. Stuff's going on. We have to tell you things. We couldn't get in touch with you. One of the zombies that attacked last night got caught by public works and killed. And the other one is missing. We don't know what's going on. The main zombie, like the head zombie, he's okay. He's still with us. And more mysteries to solve. We're trying to figure it out. But then so much happens about trying to figure it out. I don't have to tell you everything in order. She goes back to work. They're working on the book. She's been trying to hire new people, right? She's hired some people. And at one point, they're like, okay, the zombie that went missing, he's still not found. And her boss says that the construct guy quit his job. So he's not even working there anymore. And they still don't know who would have done that. He has a friend that he can call, the friend who's someone who makes life, someone who makes constructs. They call him Zoidists, hard to pronounce. Zoe means life, so life maker, basically. And he says, usually life makers are women, but this guy I happen to know is a guy. So they call him, they ask him for help. His name is Ben. He can't really help them. So he says he's going to try to look into it. That happened earlier. So after a while, the vampire boss is like, look, we're going to go to the zombie's house to see if we can find him because he's been missing for a while and we can't find him. So they go to Rodrigo's house to look for him, and he lives in a dilapidated, condemned building, like in the middle of this horrible neighborhood in New York. And she's like, what, zombies can like have jobs and like have lifestyles, but they can't get housing? And he's like, yeah, sucks to be a monster. So they go into Rodrigo's house. He's not there, and they're kind of snooping around to try to figure out where he might have gone, why he disappeared. He was the one who actually attacked the Mur guy, so there's a price on his head. And he looks in the refrigerator and he's like, yeah, there's no brains in here. Someone stole his brains here too. Who would be stealing the zombies' brains to try to make them go feral? And he's checking out the condiments, and he realizes that in the condiments, there's formaldehyde. And if a zombie ingests formaldehyde, it also makes them go feral. So the zombies can only have fresh brains. They can't have preserved brains. So someone had spiked the condiments with formaldehyde and has been doing it to all the zombies in the area to try to be uprising to get all the zombies to go feral, and trying to just start shit in New York City. They're like, who would do this and why? A mystery we have to solve. So before they can leave this place, all the zombies that live in this zombie apartment complex start attacking them because they've all gone feral and they're all, out for brains. Zoe's got brains. So Zoe, who's been training for a while with Granny Goodmay, now has some zombie fighting skills. So there's a big old zombie fight, and Phil the vampire is fighting the zombies, but there's a lot of zombies. It's hard. And then who should show up to save the day but Zoe's hot neighbor? And he's, he comes in and he starts fighting the zombies. And between the three of them, they kill off all the zombies. And they're good. And they're fine. And then Rodrigo comes home. And he bites the hot neighbor. And just before Phil the vampire kills him. So now the hot neighbor has a zombie bite. And they're like, no, you're going to turn into a zombie. And he's like, kill me. I would rather die than be a zombie. Meanwhile, Zoe knows that zombies have like perfectly functioning lifestyles in the city. Like he could still be, live in the city as a zombie, but no, he doesn't want that. He works for the other side. So he's like, kill me, please. So Phil the vampire says, I could call my friend Ben, the Zoidist, who, happens to be the only male Zoidist I know. He knows how to stop a zombie bite from turning you into a zombie if he can treat it fast enough. And Zoe's like, how come everybody doesn't know this? Why doesn't everybody do this? He's like, because usually it's not just one bite that you can treat. Usually they get their brains eaten. Like it's very rare that in a case where you get just one bite. So she takes her sexy neighbor home to their apartment because they're neighbors, into her apartment. And Phil goes to get Ben, the doctor. He's basically like a Dr. Frankenstein kind of guy. But there's several like schools of life creators. So there's the kind of like the Frankenstein life creators. He is of the Jewish school, so he makes golems mostly. That's the kind of thing he does. But he has also studied in the like New Orleans hoodoo school, so he knows some aspects of that life creators. Yeah. So he comes over, he treats the sexy neighbor's wound. He's like, you won't turn into a zombie if you follow all these instructions, and you'll be okay. And then sexy neighbor goes home to bed. Phil and Ben, the mad scientist and Zoe sort of like make a plan. Oh, but before this happened, before she got the sexy neighbor home, as they were leaving the building, because Phil had left to go get Ben, it's just her and the sexy neighbor, and they get attacked by the construct. The guy with her ex-boyfriend's head attacks them. But then Granny Goodmay shows up, saves the day, chops him into pieces, rips him apart, and she finds out that the way constructs work is they're like golems, so they have to have that Hebrew word written on them, and usually it's on the forehead, but she finds his was under his arm, and she's like, oh, I know who made you, because there's only one person who makes constructs that puts the word under the arm, but he's destroyed, and they figure out that he was also the one spiking the zombies' food with formaldehyde. So not only was he put into Zoe's office with her ex-boyfriend's head just to mess with her and be mean to her, but also he's the one who stole the zombies' brains and was causing the zombie uprising. And he was behind it, but clearly he's working for someone, because that's how constructs work. Like, they have a mastermind behind them who orders them to do things. Yes, his name was Wesley, and he was a dick. So they stop him, but they still don't know who's behind it. So later on, she tells Ben about it, and he's like, oh, if it was under his arm, then I know exactly who made him. It was someone that I used to work with, someone from my past. So, they're like, is that person coming here to attack you? What's going on? Why are they attacking Zoe? How is she involved? Mystery, mystery, mystery. Meanwhile, Zoe's got to have a writer's meeting. And Phil's like, you were going to have this meeting at Zoe spends the weekend, because it's the weekend. She sleeps it off. She sort of like heals. She's got a bunch of wounds, so she's sort of like recovering. She goes and tries to buy coffee for her sexy neighbor and bring it to his house, and he just like doesn't even want to talk to her. He's like, you work for them. You work for the other side. Like, yeah, you saved me. You brought your doctor friend to save me, but no, I don't want to be your friend. And she's like bummed, because he was very sexy and she was into it. And now he's like mad at her. So she does more work stuff. She has like a meeting at work. She has to get her book outlined. She plans everything, figures that out. And meanwhile, sorry, I just heard a clatter. All right. Book stuff happens, work stuff happens. She starts growing closer to the sexy neighbor. Her friends, Morgan and Gwen, come over to talk to her. And the sexy neighbor bursts in. He's like, there's a death goddess in your house. And she's like, I'm okay. They're my friends. And he's sort of like, I don't know what to trust. I don't know how to feel about you. But meanwhile, the death goddess says, I always know when you're going to die, and I won't tell you because that'll creep you out, but soon. And now, as soon as your sexy neighbor came in, it suddenly was not so soon. So you should stick with this guy, because he just changed your future death date to make it less soon. And so he's like, oh, maybe I should stick with him. So she starts bonding with the sexy neighbor. They start getting closer. They start getting friendlier. And they soon figure out that the only person who could have made that construct is this person that Ben did like witch doctor school with, who worked down in New Orleans with him when he went to do his like internship down there. And it turns out it is the wife of the publishing guy that Zoe had slept with, who was a cop who tried to kill her and like turned all the cops against her. Same person. So Zoe's like, why would she do all this just to get back at me for sleeping with her husband? And they're like, we think she has bigger plans. This seems like a much bigger plan than you. Maybe she just found out you were here and tried to like mess with you while she was on the way, but something big is coming. Something big is going to come and attack the city. And Granny Goodmay is having like predictions and premonitions. And, the death goddess is like, yes, I feel a lot of death coming. So they're finding out that something big is happening. And meanwhile, the husband of this woman, his name is Godfrey, and he's a real asshole. He calls Zoe and he's like, hey, my wife and I are coming to the city. Can we hook up while we're there? And she's like, no, your wife almost killed me. I'm not seeing you again. So she knows they're coming. And she's like, okay, so this person who made this construct, who's attacking me, who's trying to get the zombies all riled up, is now coming to the city soon. And so Phil the vampire is like, okay, you and your sexy neighbor who works at Public Works are going to go to Public Works and try to warn Public Works about this, because Public Works is the monster fighters, right? Tell them something big is coming. Tell them we know something bad is going to happen. We don't know what, we don't know when, but to be on their guard and to take this seriously. And because he saved the sexy neighbor's life, the sexy neighbor has to do it. Otherwise, he'll suffer. So even though he doesn't want to, he takes Zoe to work. So Zoe goes to work with him. And he's like, I don't know how my boss to talk to. This is going to be horrible. I'm going to get fired. But they go there, and it turns out the boss is Coterie too. She's a big fertility goddess. So she sends the sexy neighbor out of the room, and she talks to Zoe, and she's just like, so you got this, like, mad scientist golem making lady coming to town, and you think she's going to do some bad stuff because she's trying to rile up the zombies? I'm not worried about that. We can handle some zombie uprising. No big deal. And Zoe's like, you really should take this seriously. And the fertility goddess is like, I'm just going to sexily eat a pomegranate and not really pay attention to you. So Zoe leaves. But then there's like a power flicker in the Public Works headquarters. She's like, that's unusual. We should never have power flickers. Everybody go down into the sewer tunnels and check it out. And they're like, okay, Zoe, go leave and be safe. And she's like, I'm going to do the opposite of what you tell me to do, because that's apparently how I function. So she pretends to be a Public Works person, and she goes down into the Public Works sewer tunnels to follow her sexy neighbor and his coworkers. And they find this giant snake wrapped around a water pipe and electrical cable at once. And then she goes and she calls her boss the vampire, and she's like, what is this giant snake? And he's like, oh, that's a water demon. It's like a 40-foot long snake with like 3-foot long fangs. He's just following the chaos. He senses that chaos is coming, and he's heading toward LaGuardia. They figure that out. So they're like, chaos is going to land in LaGuardia soon, and he's headed that way. Just ignore him. They're like, except we can't, because he's going to just destroy the water main and the power cables, and the water demon of chaos, Apep. He's like an ancient Egyptian thing. So they go down, and there's like a big battle scene where they're fighting the water demon snake guy. He's taking care of the 3 Public Works guys, and Zoe has to come in and save the day. She knows that if you stab it and leave the knife in, it'll get paralyzed. So that's what she does. She saves them. But then her sexy neighbor is like, I'm going to chop this giant snake in half. And she's like, no. But he does it, and he chops the snake in half. So the half with the knife in it stays paralyzed. But the other half grows a new head, and now you have 2 water demons. Giant snake is attacking again. They're fighting again. And she takes her knife out of the paralyzed half to try to do some fighting, but that's stupid, because then she gets eaten by the paralyzed half, and it slithers away with her inside its stomach. But its back half is still cut off, so eventually she gets her knife out and stabs it to paralyze it again, and she gets pooped out the back half. And she somehow forget the head slicing thing? Did I forget something? Okay. So she gets pooped out, and Granny Goodmay is there, and Granny Goodmay takes her off to her, she's a homeless person, so she lives in the sewers, to her little grotto where she lives. And Granny Goodmay has started talking in riddles, and she's much less coherent than she was. And all this time, Zoe has also been hearing this weird voice in her ear that's been giving her warnings and stuff. And Granny Goodmay has always, all this time, been talking about that she's taking orders from someone, and she only refers to them as she and her. So she never says a name. It's just, we know it's a female person that's giving her orders that she's working for. So Granny Goodmay helps Zoe gets home. Zoe is very beat up, very damaged. Zoe gets home, she takes a shower, she washes off all the snake juice and all the sewage, and then she goes to the urgent care clinic, and she gets all stitched up and patched up. And then she goes back home, and that's when she bumps into her boss, and her boss is like, we got a meeting at 3. And she's like, what? I don't get a day off? And he's like, well, it was supposed to be at 11, but I bumped it back to 3. So, and then she does all the book stuff, right? Okay. So now we're back to where they figure out that who's coming and why. And they're like, well, we know she's going to land in LaGuardia, and they kind of figure out around what time she's going to land because they have monitors on that kind of thing, but they don't know exactly where. So Phil the vampire, Zoe, who is very beat up and scratched up, and Morgan the water sprite, and Sexy Neighbor, the vampire hunter, are all going to go to LaGuardia and try to catch Lucy, the mad scientist golem maker, before she can like be unleashed on New York City. But the only way to get in, because this is after 9/11, is if you have a plane ticket, and you can't bring weapons in. So they just bring like fake luggage, and they can't bring any weapons in. She's like, this is a bad plane. We're all going to die. Oh, thank you, Faye Rivera Productions. Just wanted to clarify, I was doing a Hercules reference there, since the cutting of the demon reminded me of the Hydra. Oh, yes. It was very Hydra-like. But at least it only sprouted one new head, not two, right? So they go to the airport. They go in the airport. There's a special like VIP lounge that they go to that's coterie only. And in there, they can sort of rent weapons. But humans aren't allowed to touch these weapons. And Morgan the water sprite says, I don't need any weapons. I'm fine. And Zoe and Sexy Neighbor aren't allowed to rent weapons. So Phil the vampire gets some knives, and they go off to try to find where the plane's going to land, where the mad scientist is going to be. And Ben, the other life maker, is there with them. So Ben has a duffel bag full of what she thinks is blankets. Turns out it's full of dirt. And he's going to make a golem with it. And that's what he does, because he makes mud golems. So while they're walking down the airplane terminal, they see Godfrey and Lucy walking by. And she's like, they're here. So Ben goes over and he's like, Lucy, my old co-student when we were in school. And she's like, Ben, what are you doing here? And they have a sordid history because Lucy had killed their teacher and then tried to kill Ben, and Ben escaped. Or she like sent a vampire after Ben, and Ben got rescued by this other guy. And that's how Ben met his husband. And now his husband really hates coterie. So Ben's not really supposed to be working with them because, but that's their backstory. So Ben turns his dirt bag into a mud golem, and he's like going to attack Lucy with it before she can get out of the airport and do stuff. But Lucy turns the airplane check-in desk and some like computer monitors and chairs into a golem. She could just like make a golem out of anything. And the two golems fight. They have a golem fight. And while Ben is trying to control this golem, Lucy's like really like concentrating and trying to control and really sweating. And they're like, wow, she really has to work hard to control this golem. I thought she was super powerful. But turns out it was just a distraction, because even though her golem's big and has like a computer monitor head, and they're like, how do you wipe a symbol off the forehead of something that's like pixels? Which they wound up doing. The water sprite attacked it and like shorted it in water. And that's how they did it. Meanwhile, the death goddess has also shown up. And the death goddess travels by flock of sparrows, which is very creepy and cool. And she's just like, I'm here because so many people are going to die here tonight. And I just want to soak up all the death energy. So then the roof of the airport gets ripped off by a bigger golem. It turns out Lucy while she was concentrating, she was really making this giant golem outside out of baggage trucks and an airplane. It has like an airplane for a head, and then like a body made out of a bus and baggage trucks. So this giant golem comes in and attacks. Meanwhile, like airport security has shown up. They're shooting everyone. Then like a SWAT team shows up, and there's a big old fight. Lucy jumps up into the airplane golem, and the airplane still has like an entire airplane full of passengers, and they're all in there screaming. And she escapes with her giant airplane golem. And then a SWAT team shows up, and they're about to arrest Zoe and everyone else. And turns out one of the SWAT team was a former public, and he recognizes the Sexy Neighbor. And so, that was a close call. So he lets them go, and he's like, his name is Chet, and he's going to like help them out. And so he joins their team, and they get some medics on site because Zoe has really gotten her ass kicked this time. She's like broken her arm. She's very beat up. Ben is sort of at his wit's end. He's got very beat up, and he's just like a golem maker. He's not a fighter. Oh, Lindsay P, thank you for the $4.99. Then they get patched up, and they give her Vicodin for the pain, and they're like, you're probably going to be really tired very soon, so get ready to sort of pass out. And she's like, no, I gotta fight. I can't give in to the Vicodin. So they all get in a taxi, and meanwhile, there's been this like sort of subplot going on about like the coterie taxi, the coterie ways of traveling. Excuse me, I'm gonna cough. Let me mute myself while I cough. My camera has a mind of its own. Did you see it just moving, just following me? It wants to give me no privacy. So, coterie ways of traveling. There's coterie taxi drivers that know secret shortcuts under the city that are covered by illusions. So they get in some coterie taxi, and that's a whole like aspect of the book that's really fun. And she has like a special taxi driver who's her friend. No, I'm okay. I was just sometimes if I talk too much, I just have to cough. Maybe it's the wine. I should drink more. So they get in a taxi, and they're trying to follow this giant airplane golem, but Gwen, the death goddess, sent her little birds out, and she figured out that the golem has gone to Central Park. Where else could a giant airplane golem hide? So they take the taxi to Central Park, and the taxi actually like drives into Central Park, into the forest, and they're like, how do you do that? Coterie magic. So they get there. They don't know what they're going to do, but they have the SWAT guy to help them have some weapons now. Like he gave them all weapons, and they're like, we're ready to fight. So they get there. Meanwhile, Zoe's kind of passing out from the Vicodin, but Granny Goodmay shows up. She gives her some smelling salts, and she's like, all right, get ready to fight. Use all the training I gave you. So they go into Central Park, and they see Lucy there. Meanwhile, Godfrey, Lucy's husband, is like, what's going on? I don't understand everything. I didn't know my wife was a secret monster maker. And Phil the vampire attacks Godfrey and starts drinking his blood. This happened back at the airport, right? And Phil is like about to kill Godfrey. And so he's like, no, he's an asshole and he ruined my life, but you can't kill him. And the only way that she can get him to stop killing Godfrey is by touching the knife that she wasn't allowed to touch, which makes Phil have to puke, because that was the rule. If a human touches this knife, it'll make you puke. So that's how she got him. So Godfrey's gone off with the medics. So now they're going to the Central Park, where Lucy is there, like communing with nature. She's lit all these bonfires. She's got her giant airplane golem. So it's basically like a transformer that's made out of like an airplane head and baggage carts. And behind her, and they're like, what is she doing? She's like doing some ritual. She's summoning something. So they're all trying to attack. But she can also turn the trees into golems. So there's like a fight, and she causes an earthquake. She makes a ground split, and Chet, the SWAT guy, falls into a giant hole. It's a big battle. It's attacking. Granny Goodmay keeps saying cryptic stuff, and Zoe keeps hearing that voice in her ear. And it turns out what was happening is Lucy wants to summon the spirit of New York City, which is a sentient being, which is the voice that was talking to Granny Goodmay and Zoe all this time. It's the she that she kept talking about. So the spirit of New York City, she wants to summon the spirit of New York City and put it into a golem so she can control the spirit of New York City. This was why she was riling the zombies up to create a zombie uprising. This was why she was like sent this construct after Zoe. She just wants to like destroy New York City. We don't know why. We don't know her motivation. We don't know anything. So, she starts constructing this really big golem. So you thought the airplane golem was big. This new golem has like city buses for hands and an entire library building for its body and like 18 taxi cabs smushed together for its head. And just like, so all these things are sort of flying through the air and forming into this giant transformer thing. Meanwhile, Ben has figured out how to wipe the symbol off the airplane. And so he stops the airplane golem and he gets all those passengers free and they all escape. So at least they're safe. Zoe's getting her ass kicked more. She's like really in bad shape. Phil the vampire can't do anything. Morgan the water sprite can't do much. Gwen the death goddess is trying. They're all trying. They're all kind of failing. So the giant library building golem has a city of New York spirit trapped inside it now. It's very angry. The city of New York does not want to be in a golem. And it's sort of stomping around, destroying everything. And they're trying to attack Lucy and fight Lucy. And the golem is sort of stomping away down towards Times Square. Eventually, they do attack Lucy and stop her. The vampire eats her and she dies. But the golem doesn't stop. And they're like, if we stop the Zoetis, the golem should stop. Why isn't the golem stopping? They don't know why. Ben is now completely depleted after stopping the airplane, so he's useless. He can't help. But it turns out that Phil, by drinking the full life of Lucy, now has Lucy's power. So they're like, okay, Phil, the vampire, you can now raise a golem yourself. So they decide to like turn a subway train into a golem. So they get Public Works to clear all the passengers off a subway train. He raises the subway train up through the ground. And he's like, the subway train is going to turn to golem, but he doesn't know how to control it. And Ben's like, because you've not done any training. You don't have any schooling. You have the power, but you don't know what to do with it. So it winds up kind of useless. Doesn't help. But meanwhile, because of the blackout, people are looting. All the monsters have come out in the streets and they're taking advantage of it. We have learned before that the only reason the monsters don't kill everybody all the time is because if they did, there'd be no one left to eat. So the Public Works exists to keep them in a balance, and the monsters are okay with this balance because without the balance, they'd, win, but then there'd be nothing left to eat. Excuse me. So if this is sounding a little bit chaotic and random and very rushed, yes, it's because I'm just trying to sum it up for you and my memory isn't perfect, but it also is kind of written that way. Stuff just keeps like, they keep like, well, how about this zany plan? And then it doesn't go anywhere. So even though he raises the subway train, he doesn't turn the subway train into a golem and nothing happens with it. But what does happen is while they're doing that, the monsters that are looting the city are fighting with like gang members that are looting the city. And this like bunch of monsters attacks them. It's these vampires that are like, we don't follow the rules and we're going to take advantage. So now I'm attacking. So Granny Goodmay is fighting. Phil the vampire is fighting. Sexy neighbor is fighting. Chet the SWAT guy is fighting. And Zoe is fighting. Big old fight between vampires. There's several monsters, big street fight. But one of them is a fire demon. And what Granny Goodmay had trained Zoe earlier on fire demons is the only way to destroy them is if you like open up a fire hydrant and let the water out. So the fire demon attacks Granny Goodmay. She's on fire, like her hair's on fire, her skin's on fire. He attacks Sexy Neighbor. Zoe does get a fire hydrant open, but it shoots the wrong way and it doesn't help her. So she gets a coat wet and she goes over and she puts it over Granny Goodmay to get the fire. So at least she like saves her life. And then Morgan, the water sprite, who's been like kind of useless this whole time, just there for moral support. She's not a fighter. Turns herself into a wave of water and stops the fireman, but he completely evaporates her. So like her sprite essence is gone. So she's gone. We don't know if she's alive. We don't know if she's dead. She's evaporated. She gave herself up for the fight. Granny Goodmay is now like a scarred, burned mess, but she's okay because she's a badass. She's still talking to the spirit of New York that's in the golem. And she realizes that the golem is very upset. It's very lonely. It just wants to be one with the city again. And the only place it's going to try to go to water for some reason. So they want to try to get it to go into the reservoir before it like stomps all over Times Square and kills everyone. So the only way to get it to go to the reservoir is for them to like connect with it on an emotional level, because it turns out both Granny Goodmay and Zoe are city speakers or city talkers. They're people who can talk to the spirits of city, and that's a very rare talent. So Zoe wants to keep the secret. And they eventually talk to the spirit of the city in this golem. They get it to come back. It opens its library doors, and Granny Goodmay goes into the library, and the golem kind of like eats her or embraces her, and then it goes into and dives into the reservoir and just like goes underwater. And Granny Goodmay is one with the golem now. And problem solved. Golem's gone. Lucy's dead. Ta-da. Cut to a month later. Only a month later. Zoe has finished her book. Her book is being published now, which is a very fast time frame to write an entire travel guide. Her sexy neighbor is healed from his burns, but they haven't really like interacted much because she's been working on her book. They took some time apart. Phil the vampire is still her boss. He's okay. She saw a side of him she never wanted to see. John the incubus is still there being sexual harassy, but he's fine. Morgan the water sprite never came back. They don't know what happened to her. They think she's still out there somewhere, but they're not sure. Even if she got like very small molecules of water, she could regrow. So there is hope for her to come back. But Granny Goodmay is definitely gone. She's not dead. She is one with the spirit of New York now, and she is inside the library, inside the reservoir. And Zoe finishes her book, and she goes and she meets with sexy neighbor. They're like, let's go out on a date. We sort of took this time apart, but now let's start a relationship. Let's be boyfriend and girlfriend now. And so they have their little romantic ending. And she says that next up for her, now that she's finished the New York book, is she wants to go down to New Orleans and do a Shambling guide of New Orleans. And, do some stuff with coterie down there, because New Orleans is one of the biggest city for monsters in the whole world, because of course it is. As we have previously discussed. And that's where the book ends. And there is a sequel where she does exactly that, goes straight to New Orleans. The summary of this sequel mentions that her boyfriend's zombie bite is acting up and he's starting to turn into a zombie. So she needs to like solve that problem while she's in New Orleans also, besides also writing her travel guide. So shenanigans ensue. And it made it seem like there were supposed to be many books in the series, but there are only 2 so far. So I don't know if there will be further books in the series, but according to the author's notes, she wanted to do one for Boston and one for Chicago as well, at least, as well as one for London and maybe Australia. She wanted to go around the world with the series. I don't know if more are still coming or she changed her mind, because, author does a lot of writing. But that is a Shambling guide to New York City in my brief extemporaneous summary version, where I got some things very much out of order, but you get the gist. So now I'm looking at your questions. Were Phil and Ben married? No, Phil is her vampire boss. Ben is married to some other guy. The other guy saved Ben from a vampire once, but the guy Ben is married to is just a human. He is a vampire hunter. Not a vampire. Yay, thank you for coming. So glad you made it. So I don't think that Morgan is dead, which I saw you guys mentioning earlier. I think she will survive, because you notice in one of the excerpts of the Shambling guide, Zoe dedicates the book to 2 people in memoriam. One of them is Granny Goodmay, and one of them is her ex-college boyfriend whose head got turned into the construct. So she doesn't dedicate it to Morgan, so I think she would have done that in memoriam if Morgan was dead. So I don't think Morgan is actually dead. I don't think the voice actress would do a New Orleans accent for the next book if it's from Zoe's point of view, because Zoe does not have a New Orleans accent. So as a vampire book, since this is a vampire book club, focusing on the vampires, the only vampire we really get to know is Phil, her vampire boss. I like that he's not like a super sexy vampire. He's just like a guy. He does have this commanding vampire presence. He is scary, but he's also like a little bit overweight, and he's like got red hair. He's just sort of like a guy. But he does have that vampire like creepiness to her. And I think the main thing this had to say about vampires was the way that she thinks he's her friend as her boss. He gives her a lot. He's very generous to her. But when it comes down to the wire, he forces her to do something she doesn't want to do, which is to go to the public's works and talk to the boss there. And the way he forces her to do this is like, if you don't go with it, your sexy neighbor will be in excruciating pain, because that's the contract we have made. And she's like, I thought we were friends. Why are you forcing me to do this against my will? And they're like, that's vampires. Like, they're not your friends. You think they're your friends, but really, they're only out for themselves. And when it comes down to it, they will force them to do things. And I think the other aspect of the monstrousness of this book is the fact that the villain is a cop in the sort of all cops are bastards camp. It definitely has a lot to say about policing and the way people are policed and the way police work for and against the people. There's a lot of social commentary about that with the way the public works people police the monsters and the way the actual police humans for their own benefit. As far as social commentary goes, I thought that was pretty cool. Some deep stuff. Even though this is mostly a funny, silly book, there is some cool social commentary in here. I'm going to look at your questions now. Give me a moment just to see what I can see. If you asked a question earlier, ask it again because I cannot look at the chat while I'm talking. So anything you asked before, I've missed. So now is your chance to ask again. Or any thoughts you want to share about the book, anything you want me to speak up about your thoughts and feelings of this book. One thing that people in the book club mentioned was that the villain, Lucy, the cop, was very one-dimensional. She was basically a cartoon character, right? She wants to come to New York City and create this giant golem and ensnare the spirit of New York City. Why? We don't know. We don't know anything about her motivations or her complexities or what's going on. We know she's a jealous wife who's mad that her publishing company husband cheated on her. And she's mad at Zoe for being the other woman, but other than that, we don't know anything about her. Oh, thank you, Victoria Stark, for the Other than NYC or New Orleans, what other city do you think needs a shambling guide for other coterie? Are there any other creatures that you would like to be explored in other guides? What other cities? I think like Vienna would be really cool. Love to see the monster. Paris, of course, all the Paris catacombs, Rome, any place that has like an underground system, I think would be really cool to explore. I would like to see the vampires explored a lot more, obviously, but other creatures that weren't in this book, maybe more gods from other mythologies would be cool. I liked Gwen the Death Goddess. Obviously, she was interesting. I'd like to see more like that. The fact that Lucy's a cop and clearly addicted to the power she has, but why? What's her reason to dirt? Well, yeah, I don't know anything about Lucy. And then she just gets killed off. She doesn't even get like a villain monologue. Like, come on, in fantasy, and she doesn't even get a villain monologue. Sorry, I don't know why my camera keeps moving like that. Athens, yeah, that would be a cool city to explore. Boston, I can see for the Massachusetts witch links. Prague would be a good city for the Golem time. Yes, 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 I agree. Do I think Shiva will be in the series? Probably not, because Shiva is a god that people still worship. He's not a mythological person. He's like a real deity to people. It's not like ancient Roman gods, which no one in mainstream culture believes anymore, unless you're like a neo pagan, which is new, right? But it's not a dead religion. Like Shiva, very active religion that billions of people believe in. So I don't think that the author would do that like she did with the other mythologies, you know? Yes, Japan. That would be cool. We see like the Tokyo Shambling Guide to Tokyo. Vampire Guide to Shanghai. Oh, Shanghai is gorgeous. I went there once. I loved it. So scrolling up in the chat, I saw someone say they thought the book was well paced. I thought the first 80% of the book was well paced. I thought the ending was very rushed and chaotic and just maybe chaotic makes it realistic, but it doesn't make it something like finesse for a book climax. I think Zoe was fine in the climax, and as far as like protagonists go, and for her not being a victim, for her being like a hero, but the other characters just sort of would do nothing for a while and then show up out of nowhere or be useless or just come up with an idea for how to save something and be like, oh, that worked. I felt like the ending needed a bit more substance to it. The ending felt very rushed to me. Yes, Granny Goodmay was very much like Splinter. Someone said that earlier too. She was the Mr. Miyagi of the series. A lot was going on. I would have liked to see more downtime. She went through a lot for being human. Yes, Zoe got her ass kicked a lot. She got multiple flesh wounds that were deep and needed stitches. One was too deep to be stitched and had to just be like packed. She broke her arm. She's functioning on no sleep, and she's still like fighting and doing it. She has been training, she has been conditioning, so at least we have, logical setup for that, but it's not something she's ever done before in her life. And even though she's the kind of person that's like, I'm going to do something just because you told me not to, I felt like it was a lot for someone like a nobody to get thrown into. If I had any say in the matter, what would I have written Lucy's motivations to be? That's a good question. Well, I wouldn't have her just be a woman scorned because, forget that. That's very boring. For her to want to take over New York City by possessing the spirit of this, like, what's she going to do with this golem, right? So she puts the spirit of the city inside a golem, and it stomps around and causes chaos. Since we know there are demons that feed off chaos, maybe if she was in cahoots with one of those chaos demons and she promised to fuel the chaos demon by creating chaos in exchange for something from that demon, like she had some kind of contract for some sort of bigger goal that made more sense, that actually mattered to her on some kind of character level, that would work. I think that would mean there's like a bigger mastermind behind this than Lucy herself, and we have an even bigger boss to fight. But I got no indication that any of that was actually in this book. Oh, hipster coterie in Portland would be interesting. I would read that. Yeah, Lucy having a villain monologue might have helped the pacing of the ending. Like, yes, villain monologues are cheesy and cliche, but this whole book was kind of cheesy and cliche. The thing that was original about it were the world building ideas, right? Not the structure. The structure is very much like mystery, solve a problem. It's an urban fantasy structure that's tried and true. And when you're reading urban fantasy, that's what you want. But give our villains motivations, because the fact that Zoe triumphed over Lucy wound up meaning nothing, because their personal relationship meant nothing. It was mostly just like, yes, we saved the city. And there was this thing at the end of it that was just like, but the city is in danger. And we love the city so much. The city is what matters the most. We have to save the spirit of the city. And I don't think that was built up enough throughout it. I think as a writer who's writing a travel guide to New York City, it was just sort of taken for granted from the writer's point of view that the spirit of the city mattered so much. But nobody ever talked about, like, this is our city and this city means so much to us throughout the book. Zoe had grown up there, but then she left and she came back. But she has no family there. She has no connections there. She has no roots there. She comes back and she's completely alone in this city. So I didn't really get the sense that it was her city either, even though she was from there. I would have liked to see that built up better. I wonder if when we get to New Orleans, it would go into more details about Lucy's past. Well, we got to read the sequel and find out, right? I kind of doubt it if I had to guess because Lucy is dead and gone. Phil the vampire ate her, which, that was satisfying. And then he got her powers and did absolutely nothing. It was like the whole point of him eating her and getting her powers wound up going nowhere. Like the subway that he rose from the street up through the ground, just like bring a freaking subway train up through the pavement of the street onto the ground, and then just flopped there and did nothing. It was kind of okay. It's sort of one of those things like in real life, things are random and pointless. And yes, they happen that way. But in books, everything has to link together. It, I guess it's sort of like scared the vampires that were attacking, but you didn't have to write those vampires attacking in the first place if you were actually going to do something plot relevant. Just saying. You mess with one of us, you mess with all of us. New York. I am wondering why this author stopped writing the series because she seemed like she had this whole thing in mind. I'm not familiar with what this author is up to lately. But yeah, Shambling Guy came out in 2013. It's set in 2015. So it's set in the future. Horrible stuff happening in New York City hasn't happened yet, right? This book came out in 2014, so she wrote them back to back. They came out a year apart, and she mentioned that in the author interview in the back, she had all these plans for other versions. And then, it's been 7-8 years and nothing's come since. So I don't know. I've talked for over an hour now, coughed multiple times. Please forgive me for excusing myself to cough. If you have any other questions, thoughts, or feelings to share about this book, if you were part of the book club and you read it and you want to talk about it, tell me what you want me to say for you. Here's your chance. Everyone is welcome to these streams, whether you're part of the book club or not, whether you read the book or not. But for those of you who do read the book and want to say things, please speak up. I am your voice. And then, when we're done talking about this book, I will tell you what we're reading next. Almost out of wine. What are your thoughts about the book as a monster mash? Any surprising inclusions or omissions? I mean, it was surprising that werewolves were omitted, right? I got the feeling that as an urban fantasy monster mash, supernatural kitchen sink, the author was trying to be a little bit different than what was usual. So even though we did have vampires, of course, and zombies, there were no werewolves. There were no shapeshifters, really, unless you count Gwen the Death Goddess, who could turn into birds. I like that there were a lot more mythological people. There was like a Norse healing goddess who had a little cameo. There were dragons, but they were just kind of in the background. There were a lot of demons and things that didn't look human and talking about how they fit into the urban fantasy setting, as opposed to a lot of urban fantasy where everyone can pass as human. So that was cool. You had so many things that couldn't pass as human, and talking about how New York is a great place for those people, because in New York, people don't pay attention to stuff because it's rude and it's polite to just ignore everyone and be yourself. I like the Death Goddess. I thought she was cool. Another thing I really liked about this book was that it had a lot of people who weren't white in it. She didn't specify ethnicity a lot. A lot of it was very vague. We don't even know Zoe's ethnicity. We know she has black curly hair. So she could be anything, right? We know her sexy neighbor has brown skin. We know Montel the zombie is black. We know John the incubus has brown skin. But, a lot of the other things, we don't know what ethnicity they are. Gwen, the death goddess, is Welsh, but she has completely black skin, like literally black, like Vanta Black. So, there were a lot of non-white people in this book, which I am always a fan of because, diversity. Yay. So, next up for the Vampire Book Club, October read, well, first half of October. So this isn't our Halloween read, right? This is the first half of October. To read by October 13th is this book, Certain Dark Things, by Sylvia Moreno Garcia, which is an older book. When did it come out? I'm looking for the date. 2016. So, about 5 years old. But after it came out, in this edition, which you see in my hand, it sold out and they didn't reprint it. So once the printing sold out, they didn't make any more books. So it became very rare and very hard to find. And if you tried to find this book online in this printing, it was selling for really high prices, like over $100. It was impossible to find. It was very special. But then the author got a new publishing contract with a different printer and has re-released it. And it has just come out last month in its new edition, which is now very easy to find, very available. As a new cover, it doesn't look like this. It's going to look totally different when you see it. And I think it might be paperback. So now you can get it. And now that it's finally available for all of you to get easily, I want to read it because I've been wanting to read this ever since I started this book club. But I didn't want to ask you to try to find a rare book to read. So now it's not rare. Now we're going to read it. This is my executive decision. I did not have anyone vote. Everyone was very excited about this. I read this author's book that came out last year called Mexican Gothic, which was not vampires, but like a Lovecraftian horror book. And it was so good. So I'm very excited for her vampire book. She describes it as Dracula meets Daft Punk, if that excites you. It is like a noir vampire book, if that excites you. So, yes, I'm looking forward to this. I will read you the description. But before I do that, thank you, JRL Studios, for the $4.99. If this were a musical, what genre of music would this story produce? Also, any news on my sequel? Cliffhanger still has me on the edge. I will answer that when I finish talking about this book, I promise. Certain Dark Things. Welcome to Mexico City, an oasis in a sea of vampires. Domingo, a lonely garbage-collecting street kid, is busy eking out a living when a jaded vampire on the run swoops into his life. Adel, the descendant of Aztec blood drinkers, must feast on the young to survive, and Domingo looks especially tasty. Smart, beautiful, and dangerous. Adel needs to escape to South America, far from the rival necro-vampire clan pursuing her. Her plan doesn't include developing any real attachment to Domingo. Hell, the only living creature she loves is her trusty Doberman. Little by little, Adel finds herself warming up to the scrappy young man and his effervescent charm. And then there's Anna, a cop who suddenly finds herself following the trail of corpses and winds up smack in the middle of vampire gang rivalries. Vampires, humans, cops, and gangsters collide in the dark streets of Mexico City. Do Adel and Domingo even stand a chance of making it out alive? So yes, vampire gangsters, Daft Punk meets Dracula. Very much looking forward to this. Please join me for this coming month's book club. The name of this book is Certain Things. And I have included a link to where you can get it in our Discord, in the book club's private chats in the Discord. If you're not part of my Discord, the link to join is in the summary of this video. Just click that link, follow the instructions, you can join the book club. Even if you don't want to read the books, you can still join and just listen to us talk about it. So if this book were a musical, what genre of music would the story produce? Considering the level of humor in it, I'm thinking just like quirky, very bouncy kind of music, like very musical theater, classic, like modern. I don't think it would be very stylized. I think it would be very like musical theatery classic music, but with a lot of like silly songs, funny songs, patter songs, with like a few ballads thrown in. And maybe like Zoe sings a song about how horny she is for the incubus, but how much she actually wants her sexy neighbor. And she has this like really frustrated love ballad while being really turned on and really hating it. I could see that being a great musical theater number. But very like classic Broadway, I'm thinking. Like sort of like what the Addams Family musical wanted to be, but maybe actually done well instead of horribly like the Addams Family musical, because that is a bad musical. Music's not bad, but the musical as a whole is bad. And your other question, any news on my sequel for The Company of Death, another Monster Mash book? So what happened with that is, when COVID hit, my publisher sort of ground to halt for a year and everything got put off. So it was supposed to come out this year. So now it's next year, and sort of things just got pushed back. And I don't have a date yet, but as soon as I do, I will let you know. I promise. I'm sorry about the cliffhanger, but I'm glad you want to know more. Link Discord. The Discord link is in the description of this very video. Just go to the description and you can get there. I promise. Do I know when the Audible book is coming? The audiobook for my book? Which audiobook are you asking out? For Certain Dark Things? The audiobook for my book, The Company of Death, has been out since the book came out. The audiobook for the sequel would come out maybe like a month after whenever the sequel comes out. But the audiobook for The Company of Death is already out and it's been out for a very long time. Oh, the second book, yeah. So instead of coming out like the day the book comes out, the audiobook is usually like a month behind. Depends on the contract. Maybe with the contract this time it'll come out at the same time. But my publisher, once it goes to publish, it publishes pretty quickly. So sometimes the audiobook takes longer. But I'll let you know. I'm very excited to read Certain Dark Things. I'm going to tell you what the people say about it. Delicious, gritty, carves out the heart of Mexico City. If the girl with the dragon tattoo met and devoured Interview with the Vampire to the twinned rhythms of Octavio Paz, Bram Stoker, and Ozo Matali, you might come close to the layers and textures of Certain Dark Things. Certain Dark Things is vicious and brutally beautiful. Not since Anne Rice's seminal Interview with the Vampire has the vampire story been so radically reimagined. Certain Dark Things is dark, inimitable, and so very, very cool, unmissable. Sylvia Moreno Garcia's gritty novel is steeped in the history of Mexico City and the vampire lore, and yet manages to deftly reinvent the bloodsucker. The wonderfully complex Adele and her 21st century Renfield, Domingo, are revelations. Certain Dark Things packs a wallop. So I really like this author. I think she's very cool. If you can afford it, I would really recommend purchasing this book and buying the book instead of just borrowing it from a library or something, just to support her and help this person write more books, because she is awesome. She's been nominated for the Hugo for other books. She was sort of like one of those tiny authors that recently did really well and started making a name for herself, even though she's been like working the grind for so long. She definitely needs your support. She is the editor of a short story magazine that's on Patreon called The Dark, which is really cool. That's like one of the only Patreons that I'm a member of that I like. So yeah, if you can support this author financially with your dollars, purchase her book, which I have linked in the Discord and is easier for you to find. I like all the comparisons to Interview with the Vampire, but I feel like everyone's going to compare everything to Interview with the Vampire, especially when it comes to reinventing the vampire. Every new vampire book, movie, everything is always trying to reinvent the vampire because everyone wants their vampires to be different, because if they're the same, no one's going to publish them, no one's going to produce them. You have to be like, well, what makes your vampire special? What sets your story apart? But if this one actually successfully does it, that makes me happy. So I'm glad. And it does help authors to check out their books from libraries too. Not as much, but it does help. So, use your local library, support your local library if it's not in your means to actually purchase this book. It's all good. Do I think Godfrey got turned into a vampire? No, I don't think so. That would be an interesting twist if he did. But I feel like there'd be more of a hint of that if he did. I think Godfrey's gone. I hope he's not in the sequel because he was just like a slimy, wet weirdo. And I don't want to see him. I think Zoe needs to move on. She's got a new sexy boyfriend now, sexy neighbor boyfriend. All right. We have been talking for an hour and a half, which is usually about how far we go. I'm going to give you one last chance to share any thoughts, feelings, or ask any questions about either of these two books, or about me, I guess, if you want to. Now's your chance. Thank you for joining me for the Vampire Book Club. I love talking about vampire books with you. As you can see, I have a great many vampire books to read that I hope you will read with me, because I'm not motivated to read them by myself, which is why I started the Vampire Book Club in the first place, to read vampire books with me. What about cricket, Rachel Bow? What about it? Do you see my cricket creations on my shelves back here that I made? I've shown those to you before. You don't need to see them again. Will I ever stop asking you to send me vampire books? Be like, please stop. I have enough. Please, no more. Probably not. And yes, Asmon, I got your package today at my P.O. box. I just got it today and just opened it up. Thank you so much for sending to me. And your art, it was so cool. I need to get a frame for it. I'm going to put it on my wall. I'm going to make another video about the new vampire books I've gotten so I can show everyone the art that you made for me. It was so beautiful. What's wrong with my Discord? My Discord works fine. Everyone chats in my Discord. If you've got a problem, message me and I will help you fix it. Yes, there was an Addams Family musical and it was terrible. Absolutely terrible. Right. Thank you all so much for joining me. The next vampire... Why is my camera moving? Is it because I did... Oh my gosh, my camera has a mind of its own. Next Vampire Book Club will be around October 13th, because we always meet on the 13th unless it falls on a weekend or a holiday of some other description. So you have 1 month to read Certain Dark Things, and I look forward to discussing it with you. In the meantime, please join my Discord server and chat with us about Certain Dark Things in our book club discussion channel, or about any vampire books you like in any of the other channels. We talk about vampire movies. We have a memes channel. You can do whatever you want in my Discord as long as it's on brand. What is brand? This is brand. Have I tried the Monster Mash cereal? No, not yet. I just found out about it today. But I'm looking forward to that. Have to go find it. Thank you for joining me. Until next time, read more vampire books. If you want to send me vampire books, you absolutely can do that. I do have plenty of vampire books. I don't need vampire books, but if you want to, I will happily take more vampire books. But thank you very much. I'm looking forward to next time. I love you all. Good night. Good night.